I stood there in the half-light of the garage, holding a crowbar I hadn't used in years, looking at a marriage I suddenly didn't recognize. 63 years old. Retired tool and die maker from a workshop out near Bendigo. And there I was at 6 in the morning, ready to tear down a wall to surprise the woman I'd shared 41 years with. The kettle was whistling somewhere back in the kitchen. The magpies were carrying on in the gum tree out the back. And I had no idea, not one bloody clue, that by lunchtime I'd be sitting on the cold concrete floor with my hands shaking, looking at evidence that the last decade of my life had been a story someone else was writing. My name's Walter Hennessy. Most people call me Wally. My wife of 41 years is Eileen. Eileen Margaret Hennessy, born Pritchard, 61 years old. Primary school teacher for most of her life. Recently semi-retired and doing relief work 3 days a week at the local school in our town, just outside Ballarat. We'd raised 2 kids in this house. Our boy Andrew lives in Brisbane now with his own family. Our girl Caitlin is in Melbourne, 34, a physiotherapist, expecting her first baby in November. That was the whole reason I was in the garage that morning. Caitlin had rung us a fortnight earlier and said she and her husband Brendan wanted to come down for Christmas, but the trouble was, their flat in Carlton was being repainted right after, and they'd need somewhere quiet to stay for 10 days with the new bub. Eileen had hugged the phone like it was the baby itself. I'd watched her face light up the way it used to when the kids were small, and I'd promised myself, then and there, that I'd turn the old garage into a proper guest room before they arrived. A nursery corner. A queen bed. The works. A surprise for Eileen, as much as for the kids. Eileen was away that weekend. She'd told me on the Wednesday she was going up to Echuca with 2 girlfriends from her old teaching days, Marjorie and Pauline, for a long weekend at a riverboat hotel. She'd been doing these little trips 2 or 3 times a year for the past 5 years or so, and I'd never thought twice about them. Eileen had been a wonderful wife, a wonderful mother, and if she wanted a few days with her old mates, I was the last bloke in Victoria who was going to begrudge her. So Saturday morning I was up before the sparrows, kettle on, dog fed, and out into the garage with a notebook and a measuring tape. The garage was a freestanding double, weatherboard, built in the late 70s before we bought the place. We hadn't parked a car in it for years. It had become the usual suburban graveyard for dead lawnmowers, kids' bikes, Christmas decorations, and about 30 years of accumulated rubbish. I'd planned the job out for a week. The first thing to do was clear the back wall, the one that ran along the side fence, because that's where I wanted to put a window in for natural light. There was an old built-in workbench along that wall, hardwood, must have been there since the place was built, and behind it was a stretch of plasterboard I'd always meant to look behind. Plumbing ran along part of it for the laundry tub on the other side. I figured I'd pull the bench off, knock out the old plaster, see what I was working with, then have a proper plan by the time Eileen got back Sunday night. The bench came off easier than I expected. Old screws, a bit of pulling. The plasterboard behind it was the original stuff. Brittle. Painted over so many times it looked like cardboard. I tapped along it with the back of the crowbar, listening for studs. And about 2/3 of the way along, between 2 studs, I heard something I didn't expect. A dull sound. Not the hollow thump of empty space. Not the solid thock of a stud. Something in between. Something that didn't belong. I tapped again. Same sound. Lower down, just hollow. Higher up, hollow. But there, in that one section, about chest high, something was sitting inside the wall cavity. Now, I'd been a tradesman my whole life. I knew houses lie. Old ones, especially. I figured it was probably an old offcut. A brick someone had dropped in there during construction. Maybe a possum stash. I've seen rats build nests of foil and bottle tops inside walls before. I picked up a Stanley knife and scored a square in the plasterboard and pulled it out. It wasn't a possum's nest. It was a metal tin. The old biscuit kind. the rectangular ones with the Highland tartan pattern that you used to get at Christmas. It was sitting on a small ledge that someone had screwed into the studs, deliberately placed, hidden behind the bench, behind the plasterboard, on a shelf no one was meant to find. I sat down on an upturned milk crate and held that tin on my knees for a long minute before I opened it. Some part of me already knew. Not the details, not the names, but the shape of the thing. You don't put a tin in a wall cavity by accident. Somebody had hidden this. Somebody who lived in this house. And as far as I knew, only 2 people had lived in this house for the last 36 years. I lifted the lid. The first thing I saw was money. A bundle of 50s wrapped in a rubber band. And underneath that, more bundles. I counted later. $6,400 in cash. The notes were the new polymer ones. Recent. Not money squirreled away during the 80s and forgotten. Underneath the cash was a small Nokia phone. The old, bricky kind. Not Eileen's iPhone, which sat on her bedside table every night. A second phone. A phone I'd never seen. Underneath the phone was a manila envelope. And inside that envelope was a stack of papers. I pulled them out with hands that didn't quite belong to me. Bank statements from a credit union in Geelong. In Eileen's name only. Going back nearly 4 years. The account had a balance of $48,000 and change. There were regular deposits, not huge ones, but steady. 500 here, 800 there. And there were withdrawals too, big ones. 4,000, 6,000, 9,000 once. There was a copy of a property listing for a small 2-bedroom unit in Queenscliff. On the coast, near the lighthouse. The asking price was circled in red biro. 840,000. There was a printout of an email. She'd actually printed it, the silly woman, like teachers do from someone called Gerald Whitfield, of Whitfield and Associates, solicitors, Geelong. The email was dated 9 weeks earlier. It said something to the effect of, Eileen, further to our discussion, I've prepared the draft of the new will and the separation paperwork. The property settlement scenarios we discussed are attached. As we agreed, nothing will be lodged or signed until you give me the green light. Best regards, Jerry. And there, at the bottom of the tin, was a photograph. A printed one. Glossy. The kind you get from a chemist. Eileen was in the photograph. She was sitting at an outdoor table, somewhere with a view of water, the bay maybe, Queenscliff perhaps. Hard to say. She was laughing. She was wearing a cream cardigan I'd bought her 2 birthdays ago, and she was holding hands across the table with a man I'd never seen in my life. A bloke with a silver beard and reading glasses pushed up on his head, late 60s maybe. He was smiling at her like he'd known her a long time. I sat in that garage for I don't know how long. The dog came and put his head on my knee. The magpies kept carrying on. A car drove past. Somewhere a lawnmower started up, and I sat there and let the whole thing unfold inside my chest, slow as a freight train, with everything I thought I knew about my own life passing in front of me one carriage at a time. The trips to Echuca with Marjorie and Pauline. 5 years of them. 2 or 3 a year. I'd never once questioned them. Why would I? The little book club Eileen had joined 4 years ago. The one that met at a friend's place in Geelong every second Tuesday. The way she'd stopped wearing her wedding ring to gardening because she said the soap kept catching it, but I'd noticed, hadn't I, that she didn't always put it back on straight away. The new haircuts. The new perfume. The mobile phone she said she'd lost 18 months ago and replaced. Was that lost, or had it been compromised somehow, and she'd needed a fresh slate? The bank account. The $48,000 in an account I'd never seen, in a town an hour away. Where was that money coming from? Eileen's relief teaching pay went into our joint account. I saw it every fortnight. Where was she getting 500, 800, sometimes more, to deposit. My head went to the worst places. Was she taking it from somewhere? From us? Had she been skimming the household account, the renovation savings, the long service fund I'd been topping up for our trip to New Zealand we'd been talking about for years? And the will. The separation papers. The unit in Queenscliff. The bloke with the silver beard. I'm a quiet man. Always have been. My old dad used to say I had two speeds. Thinking and sleeping. I don't yell. I don't throw things. I don't slam doors. What I do is I get very, very still, and I think a problem all the way through to the end before I say a word. I put everything back in the tin. I took a photograph of every page with my phone, including both sides of the bank statements and the front and back of the photograph. I put the tin back where it had been. I screwed the small ledge back exactly as I'd found it. I cut a fresh piece of plasterboard from a sheet I had in the shed, screwed it into place, sanded the edge, and put a quick smear of filler over the join. By the time I'd put the workbench back on top, you couldn't tell anyone had been there. The garage looked exactly as it had at 6 that morning. Except, of course, that everything had changed. Then I went back inside, made myself a cup of tea, sat at the kitchen table where Eileen and I had sat for breakfast 41 years worth of mornings, and I started to think. The first thing I knew was this. I wasn't going to confront her on Sunday night. Not because I didn't want to God. I wanted to. I wanted to put the tin on the kitchen table and watch her face. But I'd been a tradesman long enough to know you don't tear something down before you understand how it's holding up. If I confronted her, she'd have a story ready before her tea went cold. Maybe a true story, maybe not. Either way, I'd be reacting on her timeline, with her version, and I'd never know what was real. The second thing I knew was that I needed proper advice before I did anything. Real legal advice, from someone who wasn't Gerald Whitfield of Geelong. I had a mate from the Bowls Club, Reg Kavanagh, whose son was a solicitor in Ballarat. I'd ring Reg's son Monday morning. The third thing I knew was that I couldn't let on. Not by a flinch, not by a sigh. Eileen had been a teacher for nearly 40 years. She could read a face the way I could read a blueprint. If I gave anything away, the whole game changed. So I had Sunday night to find my poker face, and I'd damn well better find it. She came home Sunday at about 6:30. She hugged me at the door, smelling of someone else's perfume. A soft floral one. Was that always there? Had I always missed it? She was sun-pinked and chatty. Marjorie had won at the bingo at the Riverboat Hotel. Pauline had bought a new hat. They'd seen pelicans on the river. The story rolled out of her easy as anything, full of small, specific details, the way liars and honest people both tell stories. I couldn't tell them apart anymore, and that was the most unsettling thing of all. I made us spaghetti bolognese her favorite, and we ate at the kitchen table. And I asked her about Echuca, and she answered, and I nodded. And somewhere underneath I felt a strange new muscle being born inside me. The muscle of waiting. Monday morning, after she went off to relief teach, I rang Reg's son. His name was David Kavanagh. I told him briefly that I'd found something at home that suggested my wife had been making major financial and legal arrangements without my knowledge, and I needed advice before I did anything stupid. He cleared his diary for Wednesday afternoon. In the meantime, I started looking. Not snooping wildly, looking carefully. I knew the password to her iPad because she'd asked me to set it up for her 4 years ago, and she'd never changed it. It was Andrew's birthday backwards. I went through the email account. I knew about nothing. Clean as a whistle. Then I checked her contacts and found a Gmail account I'd never seen attached to a different name. Eileen Pritchard. Her maiden name. I logged in on the iPad. The password was the same one. There were almost 2,000 emails in that account, going back 4.5 years. Most of them were from a man named Hamish Lockhart. The bloke with the silver beard, I assumed. And yes, there was a photo of him in his signature. Same bloke. He was a retired widower, 67. Lived in Queenscliff. Used to be a magistrate. They'd met, according to one of the early emails, at a teachers' conference in Geelong nearly 5 years ago. He'd been giving a talk on legal literacy in primary education. His late wife had been a teacher. I read those emails for 3 hours that morning, methodically, oldest first, taking notes. And what I found was something I hadn't expected and didn't quite know what to do with. It wasn't, on the face of it, a torrid affair. There were no graphic messages, no salacious photos, no late-night declarations of passion. What there was, instead, was something that felt almost worse. 5 years of intimate, daily, ordinary conversation. He told her about his garden. She told him about her students. He sent her poems. She sent him recipes. They talked about books, about politics, about their childhoods. He had been to her hometown in Tasmania once as a boy. They had a running joke about a kookaburra that visited his back deck every morning, which they called the magistrate because it sat in judgment on his breakfast. And running through all of it like a thread of cold steel was the planning. The slow, patient, 5-year planning of a different life. 2 years in, she'd written, "I can't see myself doing this much longer, Hamish. He's a good man, and he's never done me wrong, but I haven't been awake in this marriage for 10 years. I've been a wife, the way a dressmaker's dummy is a person. I don't want to die having only ever been a shape someone else's life was hung on." 3 years in, she'd opened the credit union account in Geelong. She'd written to him, "It's done. I'll start putting away what I can. It will take time, but I want to be able to walk out of there standing on my own feet. Not yours. Not anyone's." 4 years in, she'd been to see Gerald Whitfield, the solicitor, for the first time. He says I have options. He says 41 years of marriage entitles me to half of everything regardless. But Hamish, I don't want half of everything. I don't want to take Wally's workshop or his super or the home he's loved. I want my freedom, and I want enough to start with. I want to leave with my hands clean. 5 years and 3 months ago, she'd written, "I've been looking at the unit at Queenscliff, the one near the lighthouse. I think I could be happy there. Not with you. Not yet. Maybe never in that way. Let's not rush ourselves. You and I are both old enough to know better. But near you, as a friend, as a neighbor, as someone who's chosen her own postcode for the first time in her life. Wally deserves the truth before Christmas. I'll find the words." I sat at the kitchen table with the iPad in my hands, and my eyes weren't working properly. Not because I was crying. Exactly, old men like me don't cry the way young blokes do. It leaks out the sides somehow. But because the picture I'd built up in the garage on Saturday, the picture of a scheming wife, a manipulative bloke, a financial fraud, a betrayal, that picture was wrong. It wasn't right either, mind you. I want to be clear about that. What Eileen had done was not nothing. She'd had an emotional affair, by any reasonable standard, for 5 years, with another man, while sleeping in my bed and eating at my table. She'd opened a bank account I knew nothing about. She'd consulted a solicitor and drafted separation papers behind my back. She'd lied to me, repeatedly, for half a decade, about where she was and who she was with. But she hadn't been stealing from me. The deposits in that account, I worked out from her emails, were her own relief teaching pay that she'd been quietly redirecting money she was legally entitled to. Money she would have been entitled to ask me to set aside in any divorce, money that didn't come from the joint account at all. She wasn't planning to take the house. She wasn't planning to take the super. She wasn't running off to live with Hamish Lockhart. She was planning to live near him as a friend, in a unit she would buy with her own savings and her share of a fair settlement. And she was apparently planning to tell me before Christmas. I sat at that table for a long time. I went to David Kavanagh on Wednesday, and showed him everything, every photograph, every email I'd printed off. He's a young bloke, mid-30s, but he had his father's quiet way about him. He took me through it carefully. He said, "Legally, none of this is criminal. The bank account is hers. The will is a draft, not lodged. The separation papers haven't been signed. The relationship with Lockhart, as far as the documents show, is not a physical affair, though that doesn't change much in family law these days, where separation is the test, not infidelity. I would," he said, "have a strong claim to a clean 50-50 split. Stronger if I wanted to push it." He could push it. People do. Then he leaned back in his chair and looked at me over his glasses. And he said something I haven't forgotten. He said, "Mr. Hennessy, the law can give you what you're entitled to. It can't tell you what you want. Before we file anything, you need to know what you want. Go home and figure that out." So I went home. And I figured it out. What I wanted was the truth, told properly, between two people who had loved each other once and might still, in some buried way, owe each other the dignity of an honest ending. What I didn't want was a war. I didn't want to take Eileen's freedom away after she'd spent 5 years building it. I didn't want to be the kind of man who, in his 60s, became bitter for the first time in his life. And I didn't want my children, Andrew and Caitlin, especially Caitlin with her baby coming to grow up and remember their parents' last chapter as a courtroom. But I also wanted her to know that I knew all of it. And I wanted her to know that she didn't get to write the ending all by herself, in her own time, on her own terms, the way she'd written the rest of it for 5 years, while I'd been kept in the dark. I picked the second Sunday in November. The garage renovation was finished by then. I'd kept working on it through everything. And the guest room had turned out a treat. New window, polished floorboards, a queen bed Eileen didn't yet know was there. I asked her to come out and see it after lunch. She walked in, and her face lit up the way I'd hoped, all those weeks ago, it would. She turned to me with tears in her eyes and said it was the most thoughtful thing anyone had ever done for her. I waited for her to finish saying it. Then I took her by the hand, gently, and I led her over to the back wall, to the spot where the workbench had once stood. And I said, "Eileen, before Christmas comes, before the kids arrive, before the baby is born, there's something I found in this wall in October that you and I need to talk about. I haven't told anyone. I haven't shouted. I haven't packed a bag. I've sat with it for 6 weeks. And I think it's time we sat with it together. I have never seen color leave a face the way it left hers. She didn't deny it. She didn't accuse me of snooping. She didn't reach for the pre-prepared story I knew. From her emails, she had been drafting in her head for months. She just put her hand on the wall as if to steady herself, and she said, "Wally, I am so sorry. I was going to tell you. I was going to tell you next week." And I believed her. That was the strange thing. After everything, I believed her about that. We sat on the new bed in the new guest room. 2 old people. And we talked for 4 hours. She told me about Hamish, about the conference, about the slow, accidental thing that had become a deliberate thing. She told me about the bank account, the solicitor, the unit in Queenscliff. She told me she had not slept with him. And after reading 5 years of her unguarded emails, I believed that too, for whatever it was worth at this point. She told me she had been lonely for 10 years before she'd met him, and that she didn't blame me for it, and that she had simply, slowly, become someone she didn't want to be in a marriage that had quietly stopped, somewhere along the way, being 2 people, and become one person living next to another. I told her, in turn, what I had done. The garage, the tin, the photographs, David Kavanaugh, the 6 weeks of waiting. I didn't soften it, and I didn't dramatize it. I told her she had taken 5 years of my life away from me by not being honest, and that even though I understood why she'd been frightened, I would not pretend it hadn't cost me something I would never quite get back. And then we did the thing I think we both knew, by the end of those 4 hours, was the right thing. We agreed to separate, properly, with a solicitor each, the long way and the kind way, 50-50. No fighting. She would have her unit in Queenscliff. I would have the house. We would tell Andrew and Caitlin together, after the baby was born, when there was a happy thing in the family to balance the sad one. We would not be enemies. We would not pretend to be friends, either. Not yet, but we would be honest. Finally, after 5 years of a quiet and almost gentle dishonesty that had nearly turned both of us into people we wouldn't have recognized. It's been almost a year now. Eileen lives in Queenscliff. She and Hamish, by the way, never did become a couple in the way you might have expected. They're close friends, neighbors. They walk along the foreshore most mornings, and as far as I can tell, that's what they both wanted all along, though Eileen says she doesn't fully know yet. And at our age, I think that's an honest answer. Caitlin's baby, a little girl, named Hazel, was born in November as expected, and we both went up to Melbourne to meet her, separately. And Caitlin knows now, and is heartbroken and adjusting, which is the right response. Andrew has taken it harder, but he'll come round. Boys do. And me? I'm all right. The garage is still a guest room. Hazel slept in it for the first time at Easter, in the queen bed, with her parents in the other half. I sit out there sometimes in the evenings, with the dog at my feet, and I look at the spot where the workbench used to stand. And I think about the man who pulled that plasterboard off in October, and I feel a kind of strange affection for him. He was about to lose a wife, and he didn't know it yet, and the thing he found in the wall didn't destroy his marriage. His marriage had been hollow for 10 years before he ever picked up a crowbar. The tin in the wall just told him so. If you've watched this far, there are a few things I'd ask you to take from an old man telling you this. The first is that the secrets we find are almost never the beginning of the story. They're the end of one we should have been paying attention to all along. If you've stopped looking at the person across the table from you really looking, start again tonight. Ask them how they are, and wait for the real answer. The second is that being right is not the same as being wise. I had every legal right to take Eileen to the cleaners. I would have won, and I would have spent the rest of my life as a small man with a large grudge. The law can give you what you're entitled to, but only you can decide what you want to be on the other side of the thing. The third is for anyone who's where Eileen was in a marriage they've quietly left without telling anyone, including themselves. Don't take the long way around through the wall cavity. Don't make your husband or your wife find a tin. Tell them. It will hurt them less than the silence will, in the end, and it will hurt you less too. 41 years deserves a conversation, not a discovery. And the fourth, the last one, and this one's for the blokes my age. The quiet ones. The ones who think being a steady provider is the same as being a present partner. Pay attention to your wife, not the one you married 40 years ago, the one sitting next to you tonight. They are not the same person, and that is not a bad thing. And your job, if you still want one, is to keep meeting her as she keeps becoming herself. Otherwise, one day, you'll go out to the garage with a crowbar and find out who she's been becoming without you. That's the whole story. My name's Wally Hennessy. The wall's been patched up properly now. And the old life, the one I didn't know I was living, is gone. What's come after isn't worse. It's just truer. And at 63, I've come to think that truer is the only thing worth having.